economic development, environmental sustainability, and food and nutrition security. And over the next couple weeks, we're going to be having opportunity to dive into each pillar area and hear from our partners, because this is a collective work that we're all doing. And so it's not just LAFPC leading the charge on some of these things. And so today, we are going to hear from a panel moderated by our very own Valeria, who's our Director of Programs and Innovation, who many of you have worked with. We will also be able to hear from Doug Smith, who is the VP of Policy and Legal Strategy over at Inclusive Action for the city, Saba Waheed, who's the Director of the UCLA Labor Center, and Adam X, who's co-owner of the Crenshaw Food Hub, and also one of our Good Food Zone businesses. So you'll be able to hear more directly from them, the work they're doing, and how that work is in alignment with the Good Food for All agenda. And hopefully you can see how your work may be in alignment, and then also how you can support their work as well. And if you aren't familiar with any of those orgs, we highly recommend you looking these up. Inclusive Action for the city primarily mission is to serve underinvested communities and build thriving local economies by improving access to transformative capital and advancing policy through collaborative research and community-driven advocacy. The UCLA Labor Center believes that a public university belongs to the people and should advance quality education and employment for all. Their research, education, and policy work lifts industry standards, create jobs that are good for communities, and strengthen immigrant rights, especially for students and youth. And the Crenshaw Food Hub is a collective kitchen space with a market, fresh juice, and selection of alkaline and other vegan foods. And the hub is just one arm of a larger effort to support BIPOC farmers across California. So as you can kind of see with those folks, we have a really good, wide range of folks working in different areas of economic development, particularly as it pertains to food. Before we get into it, there will be a lot of talking both amongst myself and the panelists as a moderator, but we still want you to be able to be engaged. So please use the chat to share comments, questions, introduce yourself, +1, supportive. Also use the react emojis because they can show up on the screen, particularly when there's a lot of folks, and we can kind of see how folks are feeling and seeing and receiving items. And then if you have any other, like if you go to the show captions or if you go to the more, if it's your screen is set up, if you need help seeing caption or anything like that, and if you want to chat anyone on the LAFPC team for any tech questions, you can also do that on the chat as well. So please, we encourage engagement throughout it in ways that make the most sense for you. And so I'm going to dive into what the economic development pillar is as a whole, just so that everyone can have a sense of it. If you haven't had a chance to read the Good Food for All agenda, I highly recommend you do. But just to make sure we all know what's happening, I'll go give that overview briefly now. And let me just make sure. Beautiful. So economic development is a pillar of our Good Food for All agenda, in large part because our food system is made up of businesses, workers, and everybody around it. And so we're talking about food system work, we need to talk about the economics of it. And there has been a large growth in local food production and specialty food businesses in the region that has created opportunities and pathways for entrepreneurship and job creation. We know that grocery stores have increased over the last decade based on our State of Good Food report from last year. We know there's a plethora of convenience stores, and we know the importance of that in our food economy based on our HMLA work. On the flip side of that, we also know that that means that food is a major economic engine for the region. 1 in 10 workers in LA County work in the food system, whether it's at the production level or at the retail and food service level. And so given that, we understand that we need to be thinking about the food system also from this economic lens, and not only what's happening with the businesses, but also what's happening with the workers. And the workers, unfortunately, the latest data from 2023 are making below a living wage for the county. And we know over the last 2 years in particular, cost of living has rapidly risen as well, to where we have this opportunity for entrepreneurship and job creation, but we also have workers who themselves are food and nutrition insecure because of the low wages. And so how do we kind of grapple with creating a food system where everyone, whether you're a small retailer, producer, or worker, is able to contribute and have dignified opportunity to support themselves and in turn support us all to be able to eat and commune with our family and friends. And so the economic development pillar is really getting at how do we do that from this lens of small retailers and workers and producers with a priority population across the agenda on these. I'm not like going to dive super deep into every single one, but I think it's just important to note that these are the populations that different orgs that we know are focused on. And there are some orgs that touch all of these, and there are some orgs that really are drilled down in one particular population. And that is like to the end of like collective impact, is that not every org needs to have everything, but between all of us on our work and everyone on this call, we should be touching all of those folks. And so I'm just going to pivot really quickly into kind of going over the economic development pillar. Again, if you have not had the opportunity to read the agenda, I highly recommend that you do, and you'll be able to get much more in-depth context around these recommendations. And so the economic development pillar primarily exists to strengthen the food economy through fair wages, job creation, and equitable opportunities across the food system. The pillar has 6 different themes that I'll go through, not in deep detail, but again, you'll see all of the pieces. The first theme is small food retail and producer support. We have policy and regulation recommendations around ensuring that there's equitable permitting and funding for street vendors and home-based food businesses, simplified bureaucracy for folks to be able to get into that structure, and then also anti-displacement support. So understanding that folks turn to food system work, both because it is something that they're passionate about, but also because folks may be pushed out of the traditional workforce, and so they're going into entrepreneurship for themselves. How do we make that transition as smooth and seamless for them? And how do we support the folks who've been doing this for decades and not get pushed out of their communities? Across the board, funding is a high need for everyone. I didn't go into the specifics of our methods for this agenda, but we did end up, we had 3 convenings. We worked with our working group. We surveyed over 100 folks. We interviewed over 50 folks across the system, and funding, both in terms of loans, of expanding access to loans, targeted grants for ownership, targeted and more diverse public-private investment opportunities, operating grants in particular. So something like the Good Food Zone that is explicitly meant to cover your operating expenses in order to meet certain thresholds, and supporting infrastructure improvements. And then through all of that, how do we have technical assistance and programming that speak to collaborative ownership and worker-led food enterprises, so that those, again, engaged in the food system and the food economy are able to have a sense of ownership over their work in the literal sense? And how do we develop TA to support that? Shifting gears to our second theme, food hubs and local supply chain activation. This is really thinking about where are all of these small retailers actually getting their food from, and thinking about the ways in which that is at sometimes at a disadvantage for a small retailer who can't purchase in bulk. And so thinking about how do we support food hubs through funding for them to exist to make that easier? How do you support programming that connects for local procurement and nutrition education and farm to school programs, similar to our Cultivating Farmers program? How are we investing in that local infrastructure? And then broader than that, in terms of collaboration and coordination, how are we able to actually coordinate? This is kind of a recommendation and a theme where a lot of the work is just about us coordinating, the folks working with the retailers and the supply chain and the food is medicine, and all of us doing our own work to like run events and run businesses. How are we doing the collaborative and coordination work to actually connect the dots there? Because that seems to be the big gap. Shifting gears to our third theme, reimagining grocery stores. Obviously, we think about economic development. We're thinking a big component of that is grocery stores. And on one hand, funding around how are we thinking creatively about creating regional grocery investment funds to finance community-led grocery stores and cooperative markets. I think there's a general sense and clarity that there needs to be, again, local ownership and local buy-in, and how do you create funding for that? And then also, how do you get creative with covering costs via looking at city-owned land, which could account for some of the costs for that. And then on the programmatic and TA side, there are a lot of folks interested, thinking about and working on developing community-led grocery stores and co-op markets, but how do we have programming and TA that is supported by public community grocery models, that is supported by equitable grocery store development, and also grocery retail expansion across neighborhoods? How are we developing programs and technical assistance to ensure those things actually happen, and to ensure all the many folks, some on this call, some not, who are doing that work, are well supported and well funded? And then our fourth item here is we talked about small retailers and producers. We talked about the supply chain that they're getting things from. We talked about the grocery stores as a whole. Now I'm really thinking about, for all of those folks have workers, whether you're at a corner store, a farm, a distribution hub. So how do we also support workers, and that all of the opportunity across those are integrating labor and food equity strategies so that the workers in those businesses have living wages, benefits, and an opportunity for union protections, and overall strengthening worker protections through things like a good food purchasing standard that could raise the floor across of labor practices, so that we're not just thinking about the retailer themselves, but also like the workers they're employing and the communities they're serving. And then the other part of this is around the workforce development pipelines and investing in social enterprise workforce models that are able to leverage all the different aspects of the food system as a part of workforce development for youth, but also to develop actual career pathways for folks. And then these last two themes are really thinking about, like, as a whole, not just around this particular population or this particular type of business. As a whole, what will it take to be able to get there? Number one, cross-sector collaboration. All these people and things I just mentioned intersect with economic, housing, workforce, food policy, climate, labor. In order for all of that to happen, we need to actually have cross-sector collaboration of all those folks working together to make sure that we're able to integrate all those things and to achieve these goals. And then to that end, how do we leverage and fund grassroots power building to ensure that food justice is in place across organizing and leadership development and coalition support broadly to make sure that these things are able to be integrated? And then all the TA opportunities and examples that I shared, being realistic around what supporting collaborative service models, because no one org is going to be able to provide all of that TA to someone, but how can the TA providers really work together to create collaborative service models so that workers and businesses are able to have one place and that TA is instilled by multiple folks to make that a little easier for the folks reaching the service. And then lastly, this last thing is thinking more about like the society at large. And when we talk about food economic development and food costs, thinking about the narrative change and engagement to ensure that folks are able to see food costs in the food system as a worker issue and a community justice issue, which requires a reshaping of the narrative. And also ensuring that public awareness and marketing, that folks understand the local supply chain, folks that have a awareness around our local food systems, and increased number of trained community organizers in the good food movement, so that when folks are doing their base building community organizing, a part of that is understanding what is this person's food environment, what do they need, how can they get plugged into this larger good food movement. And so this last part is mostly thinking about what is the conditions narratively that need to make sense for all of these other items to be successful. And so that was a lot of talking. I saw some reactions in the chat. I wanted to just be able to make sure that everyone kind of sees this is the vision. In theory, all of these things are achieved over the next 10 years, and that's going to take a lot of work. Structurally, LAFPC is committed to, at the 5-year and 10-year milestones, doing like really in-depth deep dives under each one to understand like what's being done, what's being adjusted. But kind of in between those like clear bookmarked times, we have our working groups that are pushing these. We have other coalitions, and you'll hear from some of our partners who are pushing these and getting involved there. And we're tracking what everyone is doing ultimately to be able to see how these mutually reinforcing activities can help us, and then providing capacity building. Because like we started, and we'll transition to this, LAFPC is a collective impact organization. Our Good Food for All agenda is our common agenda for change. We are able to coordinate. We have different data sources from us and our UCLA and USC partners, but then this part around mutually reinforcing activities and open, continuous communication is how we're actually going to be able to accomplish this work, because no one org can accomplish all those things listed there, but us working collaboratively together can. And so that's where I'm going to transition it to Valeria, our wonderful Director of Programs and Innovation, and our beautiful panelists who are going to share kind of what they're working on, how that's aligned with the agenda, and how they kind of see this work moving forward. And again, I encourage you in the chat to post questions, comments, reactions, etc. And then I'll also stop sharing so you can see them too. can get to. There we go.
Thank you, Deja. So let's get right into it. The food economy is pretty vast and tangled with a lot of urgent issues. Aggressive ice raids being one of them that pops up for us in recent memory. And I think we can agree that it's full of hurdles when it comes to opportunities for entrepreneurs, living wages and conditions for workers. The numbers that Deja shared is specifically about how 1 in 10 workers are employed in some section of the food system. I think really speak to how urgent it is that we focus on this issue. We have a number of agenda items, as you all saw, for small retailers and producer support. I think some great ideas that have come through in this process. Some of the solutions center on cash, quite frankly, including grant making and access to capital, which is not surprising given the thin margins and low wages within the food system. Many of our more marginalized community members who experience barriers to employment often turn to entrepreneurship as a means to provide for themselves and their communities, since there is a pretty low barrier to entry, despite the challenges within entrepreneurship. That's the case for many of our Healthy Markets LA and Good Food Zone businesses. So, turning first to Doug, can you share inclusive action for the city's strategy for leveraging policy making and access to capital to support small food businesses and producers?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. And first of all, thanks for this conversation and for bringing us together around the Good Food for All agenda. So my organization, Inclusive Action, is an economic justice organization. So we invest in working people like street vendors, entrepreneurs, brick and mortar business owners. We're not like exclusively a food justice organization, but I think as everyone here knows, the food system touches everything and food justice is economic justice, is racial justice. And so so much of our work, I think, is squarely at that intersection of food justice and economic development. We have sort of three pillars or strategies to our work, and I'll talk about them and a little bit about how each engages the food economy. So our first pillar is access to capital. We are a CDFI. We provide affordable below market loans and grants to entrepreneurs who, like you said, are often shut out of other opportunities in the economy and shut out of other opportunities to access capital from a traditional bank, for example. And so this means helping small restaurant owners with the financing to sustain their business, or helping street vendors buy their first code compliant food cart, or maybe make a down payment on a commissary lease so that they can join the formal economy. Um, so there's that sort of like access to capital, creating those loan products that can help people sustain their business in the food economy. The second pillar is real estate. So we try to acquire commercial property in historically disinvested neighborhoods where local food businesses are now facing gentrification and displacement pressures. And the goal is to take that property off the market and then continue leasing to those community serving small businesses at affordable rents. And in some cases, with the goal and eventual destination of those commercial tenants becoming the owners themselves and transitioning ownership to the tenants and to community, right? And so this is a longer term strategy that can help restaurants and markets not only stay in place in their neighborhoods and continue to offer that really culturally significant and affordable food, but also build community wealth in the long term. And then our third pillar is policy. So we work in coalition to change laws, shape budgets, try to make the economy work for all of us. And so a couple of things that we've helped lead three big state laws over the years to decriminalize, legalize, and support street vendors, in particular street food vendors, to be able to come into the formal economy and to work more safely. This year, we're co-sponsoring a bill to help expand home kitchen operations. I think I saw Lauren from Cook Alliance here, who's a great partner on that. And at the local level, we're advocating for policies that support restaurant workers and business owners together, right? And so it's our approach is it's capital, it's community land, it's policy. But we work hard to not do these things in isolation. We want them to be coordinated, right? So, making it so that a street vendor can work safely, that's a policy win, but by itself isn't quite enough, right? So then helping that vendor get a loan to grow their business into a truck or their truck into a brick and mortar, that's a capital strategy. And then from that place of economic opportunity, then, being able to collectivize and own their property is a real estate strategy. And so we see this trajectory from, often food entrepreneurs find themselves in a place of criminalization and exclusion. And there's a trajectory from that place to then being included in the economy, to gaining some economic stability, and then to community prosperity and wealth. And there's really no one program or strategy that bridges that gap, but we think that several of these strategies together can make that possible. And that's how we try to approach our mix of methods and strategies.
Thanks. Thanks for providing more detail on that. And when it comes to, some of the pressing issues and what the kind of climate is and trends are, have you seen kind of food retailers experiencing more pressure when it comes to just like operating costs and kind of needing to lean on loans, or is it displacement, or are all of these things sort of tied for first place in terms of challenges?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we're seeing compounding challenges, right? I think, if you look at the last year in Los Angeles, we had two once in a generation crises between the fires and then the ICE raids. And a lot of immigrant business owners were faced this really difficult choice. Do I continue to show up to work and risk being violently kidnapped and abducted, or do I stay home and lose revenue and potentially lose my business? Those folks that did show up to work, whether they were street vendors or brick and mortar owners, then faced a smaller customer base as folks were staying home. That is compounded by rising rents and displacement pressures, often in these neighborhoods that are historically redlined and disinvested, but now become sort of, targets for gentrification and displacement pressures. And, we can get into this a little bit later if there's time, but we don't have, there's been a lot of really great conversations around tenant protections in the state, and really important expansions of tenant protections for residential tenants. Commercial tenants do not enjoy the same level of protections. And so there are really intense displacement pressures as well. In addition to, rising costs that come from whether it's tariffs or, other economic factors at play.
Yeah, true. And that echoes across the board with the businesses we work with at LAFPC. Moving over to Saba, so a big part of the food economy are the workers. So it's the labor of both small and large businesses. And in this pillar area, we're focused on how to best support these workers. They're feeding us, and we want to make sure that they have access to dignified and fair work. Over the last several years, the Labor Center has done a multiple number of reports on food chain workers, and that includes supermarkets to meatpacking workers, as well as some partnerships with farm worker organizations. Could you tell us a bit more about what the research tells you about strategies that are successful at protecting food workers?
Yes, absolutely. And also wanted to start by thanking you all for creating this conversation, and to my fellow panelists. So the UCLA Labor Center, we partner with unions, worker centers, community organizations, conduct research on a wide range of topics, but really looking at the conditions that are happening on the ground, doing surveys and interviews. And it's very much like the intro that Deja had presented, like the strategies that you all are thinking about are very much the goals that we have. Like, how can we offer living wages, benefits, health and safety standards, and really give workers a voice and a right to come together and to offer solutions for their industry. And so in the last many years, we've done research on supermarket workers, meat packing, restaurant, fast food, farm workers, just as Valeria had mentioned. And, most of these workforces are also like predominantly women, immigrant workers, people of color. And we really want to think about the kinds of standards and conditions that they're facing, and what are the levers, what are the levers that we can utilize in order to improve conditions at specific workplaces, but then across entire sectors. I'm going to name a couple of different strategies that we've seen work. One that I actually just want to credit you all, actually, the LA Food Policy Council for is really lifting up and creating models for public procurement. That really came up for us in our meatpacking project, where it was just really egregious conditions, temporary staffing agencies, precarious work. And, could something like public procurement, which again, you all had modeled in LAUSD with their student meals, is really thinking about how our school districts, our hospitals, our public colleges and universities, airports, parks, these are taxpayer funds that are often going in that. So can we actually put labor standards in how that money is spent? Can we support small businesses and businesses in terms of getting those contracts so that it lifts up both the business side, but then also adds the labor protections for the workers? So a lift all boats kind of strategy. Another one is thinking about standards boards, industry standard boards. That's where you would bring together, it'd be a board, and it's created by a city, a state, and it would include representatives across the sector. So it can be workers, employers, government agencies, and that they would set, monitor, and enforce labor standards in specific industries. So a couple of years ago in 2022, there was a fast food sectoral board that actually, as soon as it was established, set a new minimum wage for the fast food industry. And it was kind of like one of these first times where you saw like an industry wage standard. And so being able to actually bring the stakeholders to the table, and then actually they're the ones who will assess the field and bring the standards forward. I think Doug was referencing this a little bit, but like on the city level and neighborhood level, thinking about things like commercial corridor ordinances. So can we actually create some kind of local policy that could be geographic specific, industry specific, that also raises standards, but then also thinks about economic development. And so something like a citywide restaurant protection ordinance is something that really want to also bring Inclusive Action, who's been working with us on this, where it would provide tools for small and immigrant businesses, some expedited application processes for restaurants, but that there would also be a level of compliance on labor standards attached to it. So streamlining something that would allow access for businesses, but then only for those who have demonstrated that they actually follow labor laws. And then the last two I just want to quickly talk about is that, at the end of the day, we need to think about enforcement. We have a lot of labor laws out there. It doesn't work, especially when you get into like more kind of precarious sectors of the industries. And unfortunately, food work is one of those where there can be wage violations, working conditions issues, and we really believe that the best advocates for those workers are actually the advocates for those workers. So creating strong partnerships between community organizations, worker centers, and the enforcement agencies as a way where, workers trust, their advocates, letting them actually kind of support that, do some of the education work, do some of the advocacy work that would address the different issues. And then also like a way to get like on the ground information in terms of, who are the biggest violators, who are the influential bad actors, and really use that to level the playing field, because you can't follow the law if your neighbor is not, because it's continuing to undercut neighborhoods and undercut entire sectors of work. And just a really good program, and that is something called the California Worker Outreach Program, where the state is actually funding community organizations, 89 in the state, to go out and talk to workers and employers around those rights. And then the last one I just want to talk about is like, let's support worker like the right to organize, the right for workers to come together, to identify issues, to avoid things like retaliation. At the end of the day, giving workers a voice, a seat at the table, a way to be able to talk about the issues, but then also provide solutions is something we should all be working towards.
Thank you. And great to hear about the collaborative work with Inclusive Action. What might you share about, when you talked about, I was intrigued by this idea of, setting standards, in terms of, some of the research or some of the best practices you've seen out there. What can you say about adoption of those standards, like for maybe even mid-sized to larger businesses? Is it really through incentives or through, more legal and punitive measures? Like what seems to be kind of the special sauce there?
It depends, and you try all. Again, it's the levers. You use them all. So like the local ordinance, for example, is trying to give the carrot part, right? Where it's like, we will actually give you some certain kinds of access, but we need the compliance. Certainly procurement law, so procurement policies can also do that. The enforcement side is like, we'll provide the education and the materials, like we'll give you all the tools, in order to get to this place of compliance. But then at the end of the day, if it's not happening, then we have to use the punitive measures. And that's only going to work if we have enough kind of boots on the ground, that we actually have the capacity to be able to enforce. So good laws are good laws. You also have to make sure they have teeth. Good laws are about education and information, and we're not out there to try and like cut up a lot of businesses in this, but it's also like, don't, let's not do this on the back of workers, and let's not do the back, because what happens to workers happens to communities, happens to neighborhoods. So that enforcement part, that protection part is really important, both to create good standards and also to protect the ones that we have.
Thank you. I'd like to move over to Adam X and Crenshaw Food Hub. So, your organization and business, you are on the ground, directly engaged with these ideas of protection for food workers and small food entrepreneurship and relationships with producers. I know that you all aim to shift the food system to ensure that communities have access to healthy food and that farmers, workers, and businesses can have some sense of stability. So question for you is how you can share that policies like the Good Food Zone have supported the development of Crenshaw Food Hub to help meet the standards to provide healthy and affordable food and engaging with sustainable and fair work practices.
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, my name's Adam X. Start with just like the brief backdrop of how we got to the point of needing good food zones and the $25,000 grant that we got awarded last year, and just got the last 10,000 bid about a week ago. Thank God. Yeah, but we started off doing state level policy work to just really start the first leg of the food system, which is the land, the farm, and that started in 2022. And that was just direct policy advocacy at the state level to Assembly Member Aguiar Curry, who is currently, I believe, the Assembly House Speaker of the House in California. So we got money, $1.25 million from the state of California, direct from the budget to start the Ujamaa Farmer Collective. And then from that advocacy, we took it down to Southern LA, and we realized, well, we got the farm. How are we going to get the produce from our farm that we got with state money to distribute it to South LA? So we started doing pop-ups in Leimert Park with Imani Gardens. And from that energy, we eventually ended up at 7701 Crenshaw and collaborated with Kathy's Kitchen, Kathy Alston, who was part of LA Food Policy Council's Healthy Markets program. So what the Good Food Zones and LA Food Policy Council allowed us to transition from that sort of guerrilla stage of pop-ups and hype and promotion to establishing us into actual infrastructure and having like a retail building, which is a completely different game. And if it weren't for that, it was $15,000 that came right around the time we signed the lease and had to put up a security deposit and 2 months of rent. And we didn't have that money based on just pop-up sales. We were operating two, maybe three times a week at some like and with some random like events. So we didn't have like we didn't have mom and pop money. We didn't have brick and mortar money. So that money allowed us just the flexibility to secure the building and then develop the infrastructure and then drive traffic. And then now our revenue, now we can now pay the bills with our revenue. And it's still a close call. And I will say that this last bit of money, this 10,000 that came through, it allowed us to get through the winter where people just don't buy as much produce. So I would say this policy, in addition to state level policy, has allowed us to take an idea of, namely, we just want to be able to feed ourselves. We have the ability and the bodies and the energy to eradicate food deserts. We don't have the resources and we don't have the capital. But you realize in doing this work, like nothing matters if you can't pay people. So getting money from the state and money from LA Food Policy Council allowed us the ability to pay people and transition people who are working for us for free, for volunteers for years, into now they're working at Imani Guards at 7701 Crenshaw as part-time workers. And it's like legit too, not like under the table. So it's allowed us to go from guerrilla food feeders to infrastructure, and then now we have like an actual dupe. Okay, Deja, can you switch me over to this one? Am I good? Okay, sorry, I had to
Yes,
switch phones.
we're here.
But yeah, now we are yeah, we're able to go from guerrilla style to a model that can be funded and duplicated. And coincidentally enough, we are collaborating with a developer who does new market tax credits, which is a vehicle by which investors, corporations, CDFIs can invest in underserved areas in food deserts like ours. So just by having this building, which the funding allowed us to get, we're now able to actually be developers and economic developers and developing campuses where food is the center that we can then layer on housing and other elements that are vital and necessary to our communities. So yeah, long story short, the money allowed us to become like professional. It allowed us to be uh, real infrastructure, and it's allowing us to have just the foundation and the base on top of which we can develop and fundraise even more money. And then on top of we can then go back to Sacramento and ask for more money and then have a cycle and system of self-sustainability to where we're no longer waiting around, right? We've been empowered to do it ourselves and now we can. So
Yeah, and everything you're saying sort of is a testament to what our team, delivering these programs have seen. It's just that healthy food access and supporting these small local food economies does require even some level of subsidy at different points. I think it's important to recognize that. And also, I couldn't help but think about how creative you all have had to be and how challenging it's been, even though your team is pretty adept at the policy and the advocacy piece and understanding like different complex mechanisms on how to finance your work. So just hats off to you all. I'm sure you need a well-deserved vacation at some point. Um, I'll shift over to a few final questions for you all. But thinking about Adam's description of how the journey has been with Crenshaw Food Hub and some of the businesses that Inclusive Action works with, if you can think of specific examples. Doug, can you speak to the strategies and tools that you're most excited about moving forward for the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. I'll uplift three things. The first is really just, I think, co-signing what Saba was saying earlier about, I think we just need to end this false choice that we're often presented with as if we can only support workers or we can only support small businesses. And I think we can just agree that that's actually not true. And we can use our creative minds and come up with good policies that uplift the sector as a whole, where we are promoting workplace justice and investing in, the entrepreneurship and food businesses. And I think so I'm really excited about kind of the work we're doing to try to, and it's policy work and it's narrative work together, right? It's showing how a policy can uplift the entire sector. And it's also rejecting this notion that we have to choose between workers or business owners, and that we're all kind of like, it's an ecosystem that requires and deserves investment and support. So I'm excited about that work, and hoping to really kind of break through on that in the next 5 to 10 years. Um, the second thing I'll uplift is, it gets really wonky really quickly, but I think there's an opportunity to explore really productive relationships within food preparation. So there are street vendors who need to have safe spaces to prepare their food before they go out and sell. And there are legal requirements around commissary uses. There are laws that we're looking at to expand opportunities to use home kitchens safely for food preparation. There are opportunities to connect street vendors with brick and mortar restaurant owners. And street vendors can pay a little bit of rent to a brick and mortar business owner to use their kitchen during off hours, satisfy that legal requirement. It's a win-win symbiotic relationship that I think, like, historically we've again had these entities almost pitted against each other in a way that is counterproductive. And so we're really excited about exploring breaking down some of those artificial divisions and creating more kind of like co-beneficial opportunities, and solidarity within the food movement in that way. And then the third thing I'll uplift is just continuing to chip away at and promote anti-displacement strategies for small food retail businesses. I think it starts with tenant protections, right? This idea that tenant protections are important not just for your home, but also for, your business as a small immigrant business owner. How do we strengthen those baseline tenant protections? But then also recognizing that eventual long-term stability and community wealth comes from sort of that ownership and that community ownership model. And so how can we, what are the policies that we can put into place so that we can have many more success stories like Adam just shared, right? Where, we're able to not only sustain a food business, but also create that community ownership model that's building that wealth in the long term.
Exciting. And for me, reasonable and totally doable with the right amount of political will.
Yeah, easy.
Yeah. So we're talking about narrative change here. So switching over to Saba, when it comes to narrative change, when it comes to worker and community justice, which we know the Labor Center focuses on, what are some of the strategies around narrative change that you all have used in the past that you all are excited about applying for food chain workers?
Yeah. At the end of the day, the story that we want to tell is that this work is dignified. We want to show work with dignity. We want to show that it deserves the same kind of protections as any kind of work, and that the work is important. That's how you all started off the webinar, which is like, these are the hands that feed us. So why would we not give it the care and the attention? And so that's always kind of the end goal. But I actually want to talk, well, how do you do that? And we certainly saw things like COVID, where it was like essential workers. And that was so important in calling for hero pay. So how do you take moments and think of and leverage narratives that can actually uplift what's happening on the ground? And one of the really big stories for this partnership with the LA Worker Center here in Los Angeles this is like 10 plus years ago. We had done a really geeky report about kind of wage violations in like a bunch of different industries. It was a really geeky report. It was a really geeky methodology. It probably would have just gotten stuck on a shelf that somebody, that very discreet people would probably read. But at that time, our partner Kiwa, Koreatown Immigrant Workers Alliance, and the LA Worker Center Network got this really big case where it was a worker in a sushi restaurant that charges $1,000 a day, a meal, and they were just doing all these wage violations, and they started talking about that campaign, and we went back to the research because we were coming in as like, let us present some data on this. And we looked at that report, and then there was this one line Low-wage workers in Los Angeles lose $26.2 million in wage theft violations every week. And that became our tagline. And we started talking about this thing called wage theft. And it was a process of defining what it was. It was taking this very high profile, really like fancy Beverly Hills restaurant as a case of like, why would you not be able to pay your worker for breaks or for supplies and all the different ways, or for sick time? It was really basic wage violations. And then being able to really leverage that campaign and that story to talk about the bigger issues in these kinds of industries, backed by data, because we had that really geeky methodology that showed how prevalent this issue was, and then building a strong narrative. And out of that, the partners then were able to build all these tools around what is wage theft, built a website, built all these materials. It's a word that maybe now, but it wasn't then. Electeds started using it, media started using it, practitioners were using it. It actually led to the creation of the Office of Wage Standards, like one of the first in the country that was focused specifically on managing wage issues. So for that's like a great way of like taking all the different tools we have, building a strong story, using it to basically talk about what the issues are on the ground, and making sure that there's some kind of solution, advocacy, like follow-up that's going to come out of like, how do we address that issue now?
Thanks. Really great example. And that the term that's now like, part of kind of like the way we speak about these issues daily, really points in the direction of the responsible parties, when it comes to that issue. So thanks for sharing about that. Before we wrap up, and get into questions from the audience, I'll turn it to Adam to kind of try to end this on an optimistic or high note. The Good Food for All agenda does offer a very inspiring vision for a food economy that uplifts everyone. That includes farmers, retail workers, small retail owners, and entrepreneurs. So to close this out, can you speak to the items, Adam, in the agenda that would be a game changer for you to continue ensuring that the farmers you work with and that your workers are taken care of, but also, making sure that the Crenshaw Food Hub is able to stay open and thrive?
Yeah, so I want to just go off what Doug said about uh, not using this narrative of, especially in small business, of management and labor, because in my personal experience is like everyone is both. Like we all have equity in the corporation that's overseeing the property, or will at some point. That's the plan. And then we all work. Like I was making juices all summer. So there's not really that division. And I think the solution to the whole false dichotomy of labor versus management is just it's co-ownership. And you could do that through an actual formal co-op model. We don't do that. We have just a corporation. Or you could do it through an LLC or corporation where you just give equity to your workers, and or have them allow the ability to get equity into the entity they're working for. That way, everyone's more or less on the same team. So, and I've always like, because I'm a finance guy, so I've always like been a business, quote unquote, business person, but I've always been a worker. So I've never really felt the difference between the two, and I think that's a difference that that ultimately the people who get in between these two parties benefit from. So in which case it's going to be, I guess, lawyers or whatnot. So as a business person and like a small business owner, um, I just want to just further emphasize what Doug said is about, it's really about community ownership vehicles for that. And I do believe that the report does specifically call that community ownership. That's specifically what it looks like, the co-op model, or just workers with equity in the company. And also about the report that we like is just like the specific calls for investment in infrastructure. So we've shown that we could done it at the state level. It can be done at a local level. So I guess the only avenue that we haven't really explored is just like, I guess, like maybe the venture capital route, where we're going getting private dollars for investors, but that's also a valid route. But I will say that like the specific calls for advocacy calls for public and funding for these projects, because in order for you to offer a product to a market, especially where people don't make that much money, you're going to have a good price. And a lot of times, at least to get started, until you develop the economies of scale, you're going to have to get subsidized from somewhere. So the subsidies just could come from, we got the state grant from the state of California. We got the grant. It could come from a private donation, but there has to be that sort of creative thinking behind how are we going to finance this activity where we can offer the market a product that they're going to be able to afford. And then also, luckily, we have EBT that helps as well. But honestly, we don't get, our EBT sales are probably like at best 5% of our total sales per month. So a lot of it can come from like hard-earned money from people. So but yeah, and then one last point is the funding for workforce development. And I think it's important because a lot of what we want to do is to eventually transition people from consumers into getting them to ask themselves, well, where do I fit in? Like if I start growing stuff, can I start selling it? How do I do that? So training people in that regard, and then also using public funding is developing a campus to where it could be people who want to sell their produce that they grew on their front lawn, or it could be people that just want to be more of an artisan and need a place to just get started and develop a product. And ideally, you could have a campus such as us, where we started from the ground, and now we're here to come learn from us, and we can help you develop a product that you can then tap into our market to sell. So that's where we see, I guess, the collective collaboration and support.
Really great points. Particularly around framing the entrepreneur as laborer, like entrepreneur dash frontline worker. That's certainly what we see with micro and small businesses who have, the founder and maybe one or two extra workers. And again, returning to that point about subsidy and public support. It is being done all the time. I mean, military commissaries are an example of a subsidized grocery retail program that's not talked about enough. So thank you for that. We have a couple minutes for some questions, and I believe the team has launched a poll as well. Just wanted to check on the status of that. I don't see any questions popping in, or did I hear you, Deja, chime in with a question?
Okay, the poll response. I took a second for it to buffer up, but you should see a poll come up. If you have any questions, please pop them in the chat, and we can verbally share them. Also, we've been sharing all these links, so we can share them out later. The poll that popped up is really just around, like, the first question is, like, where are you doing aligned work? We know folks on the call are, like, our economic development pillar is wide and broad. So just curious of folks on the call. And then that second question is like a tip check on collaboration. Like it is like maybe you're one and you're like, this is great. This isn't super aligned with my work, but I'd love to hear what y'all are doing. Or maybe you're a 10 and you're like, actually, I probably am already working really closely with Saba or Doug or Adam, or I need to based on what I've heard today. And then we can do that. Folks can respond to that poll, but I certainly want to offer any questions in the chat. And if the questions come up later, you can also send them because I know we are coming on that hour time. And I see folks here responding to the poll, and I can share the results in a second because I don't see any questions coming in on the chat. But yeah, I hope today you all were kind of able to hear and see like the different ways that this work is all coming together. This is just an example of 3 partners. Like we have closer to 200 plus partners working at this work, some fully in environmental sustainability, which we'll talk about in 2 weeks, or food and nutrition security, which we'll talk about next week. But really just illustrating the ways in which you can already see this work is overlapping. and the ways that we can continue to support each other in achieving this good food for all agenda that is addressing street vendors and community ownership and workers. And obviously our primary focus is thinking about these small retailers and producers, and also thinking about how are the folks who are at these large multinational corporations, how are their workers being protected as we continue to develop this local food economy. And then I'll just to kind of close us out and wrap us up, is Tonya in the chat, you want to continue to be engaged in our work. Again, we have our working groups, our Good Food Economy working group, which meets tomorrow. They meet monthly, and they're moving work forward around a lot of the kind of small business and economic development work. But the focus of that group shifts obviously cycle to cycle. So if you'd like to be involved in that work, we definitely would love to see you come out to that group. Also, in the links shared in the websites for Inclusive Action, the Labor Center, and Crenshaw Food Hub, you can directly follow them. You can go hit up Crenshaw Food Hub if you'd like to get a juice. And Inclusive Action has some higher vendor programming. UCLA's beautiful Labor Center's beautiful building, Reverend James Lawson named in his honor across from MacArthur Park as well, so you can kind of follow all of those folks. But thank you so much. We definitely want to keep in touch, and we'll continue to have opportunities like this over the next 10 years, both for you all to learn what some of the partners are doing to move this work, and like LAFPC isn't leading everything, but also from the vantage point of being able for you all to have more networking opportunities, to have more discussion and conversation too. So you can kind of see the poll. There's a lot of folks doing kind of narrative change, supply chain, cross-sector work, and we can kind of, and then other things falling in between. But thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists for joining us today. Thank you for Valeria for moderating, and to our LSPC team for being in the chat and responding. If you have any questions or comments, obviously you can reach out to us, and we can make sure you all are connected to these orgs. And we hope that, again, LFC is able to play a coordinating role. There's some work that we're leading, but there's a lot of work that our role is just to connect you two together, because you can do that work together. So if you have any connection points or any curiosities, you can reach out to myself, Manager of Strategic Partnerships, or Tonya, who's on here, Strategic Partnerships Associate, who can do some of that dot connecting for you, so that we can spread our impact. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Great
Thanks,
conversation.
everyone.